Now let's move on to stage two. So stage two is starting off of the COVID crisis in North America. US and Canada, they saw a start or a rise of cases, which affected consumer behavior, which had partial lockdowns. Of course, there's differences by state, provinces, or territories. But overall, there were huge changes in demand for many products. So could you tell us a bit, what were the actions you took to really identify where you had to take action?
Well, the first thing we did when we realized that business was going to change as drastically as what we had seen in other countries is we took an immediate snapshot of what our numbers looked like. We pulled some extracts out of Slim 4 to be able to understand what the status quo was before all of this happened, and have that data at our disposal. Then as we started having lots of conversations with our sales team, with our e-commerce channel managers, and really trying to understand what we felt like the impact was going to be, we started making some adjustments to forecast. We may have done that a little too broadly, but given the time frame we were working with and the percent of business that we were anticipating trending down, we made some pretty radical changes. We didn't do that just blindly and say if business is going to be off X percent, we're going to take all business down X percent. We used the ABC stratification along with some stratification that we do internally that we actually have set up in SlimStock as well as a user-defined field. We use that to try and help us make some decisions on how much we would ramp down the average demand and or service levels. And so we made those changes, and that would have been in March to try and get ahead of this thing and start to bring inventory levels and purchasing activity down in better alignment with what the sales forecast was going to be. And we saw an immediate impact on that. We saw inventory start to reduce in, call it, mid-March, and really it's been on a downward trend since. And those are the changes we made. We more so to the actual demand themselves. And then from there, we also tried to isolate those items that were, radically different than what the overall business had been. One of the items we carried that, that didn't, or that really surprised us was pump sprayers. Now, our pump sprayers are designed for spraying chemical onto plants, vegetation, grass, that sort of thing. We saw people inquiring about them because they were going to use them to spray cleaners or disinfectants or those sorts of things. So we saw, an immediate increase there. Not huge, but again, that's an example of the kinds of items that we were having to go in and really manage one at a time, and that was up to each of the individual buyers on my team to really go in and manage those forecasts.
I think that's something we all recognize. If you're looking at some of the hoarding behavior, I think across the country, toy sales are up significantly because people spend more time at home. They're using products where they were not intended for, are buying hockey masks as protective gear. They'll add a filter or a screen to it, but there's many surprises, as you say, and that's why it's so important to use a data-driven approach versus across-the-board ramp down or ramping up type approach. After ramping up and ramping down the forecasts, you also created new buy plans, right? So you adjusted your planning and shared that with suppliers. But by that time, are they kind of back to normal right now, or are you still seeing a big impact?
So we absolutely did change our buy plans, and my team, we manage our open to spend or open to receive dollars on a monthly basis, and so we made some adjustments there. And one of the nice things about Slim 4 is it was very easy to go in and pull forecasted purchase information, compare that to the plans I put in place, and kind of get an idea of how close the receipt plans were to one another. The fortunate thing for us is that while we saw that dip in March, it was relatively short-lived compared to what a lot of other businesses have been facing, and our demand has come back and come back strong. And so just as soon as we had made the demand decreases, we immediately started, I won't say immediately, there was a lag period in there, but we started making adjustments back up. And we did somewhat of the inverse of what we had done previously. And we had that information that we had stored, what our business looked like beforehand. And selectively, we started layering back in additional demand. We started with those A items and really said, okay, we're going to take these back up to maybe 90 to 95% of what they had been before. And then we brought the B's back up, and then the C's. And again, I'm speaking in generalities. But we've been
Mhm.
over the course of the last several weeks, we've been layering those back in. And just last week, we actually took our A's up basically back to what their historical rate had been. And then we've adjusted service levels back up to where more or less where they were before, in order to get business back on par with where we've been prior to COVID-19. Now, you know, whether or not it stays like this remains to be seen. We've had some market segments that have been absolutely booming. We've had some others that have faltered a little bit, but we're actually seeing some positive signs in some of the consumer-driven markets. A lot of it, as you mentioned, people are at home, they're staying home, and they're working in the yard. They're working at home. They're doing things like that. And so some of our pruning saws and things of that nature, we've seen do exceptionally well over the last several weeks.
I'm one of those examples. I've been spending a lot of time outside. I bought a kayak. I'm doing a lot of outdoor stuff. I can imagine that some types of customers that would have not otherwise bought are actually brought to you as well, right?
Absolutely, and that's where that exception management really comes into play. You know, it helps you find those outliers, those groups of items, or those single items that really are seeing a drastic change. Obviously, anything PPE related has been very hot right now. But we've seen a lot of things that are more of that prosumer type item that have done exceptionally well. We've also seen some areas, like you mentioned, the sport climbing world with our rope manufacturers. Sport climbing is difficult right now, not because people can't get outside to climb, but because so many people use climbing gyms these days. Those businesses have been closed more or less across the country for the last several weeks, which is unfortunate. And we feel for those gym owners and hope they're able to reopen soon and operate safely.
You know, how could you go about an exercise like this? You know, no one has time to look at demand item by item. That's why it's so important to really, you know, look at impact by sales channel and customer type. You know, it could be that several end consumers, the sales are booming for certain products. You know, if you're looking at construction, a lot of people are taking up DIY work and are not hiring contractors anymore. They're buying from different channels that typically contractors would, which could change your demand as well. So if you look at typically counter sales, business to business or business to consumer is down, but your e-commerce business to business or e-commerce business to consumer could actually be significant up. And it really depends on, you know, what is the end customer and how are they buying, and that will give you strong clues as how to layer your demand back in. If we're talking about changing forecasts, there's some things that you have to take into account as a demand planner, is that changing forecasts for the upcoming week, it's very easy when you're talking about items that sell very frequent and that are have very stable sales. Even items that are non-seasonal or seasonal, that doesn't really matter. Those are items you can easily predict. After 1 or 2 weeks, you'll have reliable data because demand stays stable. It will just be less. Now, if we're talking slow and irregular or very intermittent demand, or demand that's very volatile, a 20% drop in demand, a 30% drop in demand, even a 70% drop in demand, it's hard to pinpoint whether that drop is due to the very nature of the item always being slow, intermittent, or volatile, or because of the COVID crisis. And that leaves us as demand and supply planners to a different exercise we have to take. And we can actually just leave the forecasts in place. Instead, we have to change our inventory strategy. So this is more about adjusting order levels or min-max or reorder points or whatever equivalent naming you have for it. It's about making changes to that, perhaps taking a choice to centralize this inventory instead of putting it in different branches, pulling items away from branches. Customers are moving towards ordering online more and more, so centralizing even from that perspective might make sense, leaving you with a more frequent, stable item at the DC or hub level. So when you're changing forecasts, you really have to take into account this grid, because based on how an item sells, it also tells you what kind of action you can take to ensure the proper demand plan or the proper supply plan. Now, exception management, obviously, product line, sales channel is not everything. I think, John, earlier you told me about how you've been working with sales to look at exceptions, looking at which channels are changing. Exception management really allows you to focus. If you have, how many SKUs do you carry, John? Over how many locations was it?
Let's see, approximate overall SKU count's about 15,000 over 3 different warehouses plus 1 manufacturing location.
Okay, so we're talking in the vicinity of 45 to 60,000 item location combinations, basically. Now,
Correct.
I know a planner who can really look at that, especially with a big crisis like that. So managing by exception is always important. Looking at forecast exceptions. If you adjust your forecasts, look at the outliers after that based on your adjusted forecast. But on the other hand, what is even more important is measuring what inventory do you have, and do you have any back orders, or is there any late supply? Forecasts are great, but in the end, you always sell products, so you look at exceptions on that basis as well.